Good morning and welcome to the London Assembly Economy Committee meeting being held on Tuesday the 8th of September 2020. I'd like to welcome the Assembly members who are members of the committee, our invited guests and also members of the public. Actually nobody is allowed in here at the moment, but anyone who is watching on the webcast. And I'd like to welcome everybody to today's meeting of the London Assembly Economy Committee. In accordance with current government regulations, we're holding this meeting as a hybrid meeting, with some Assembly members participating remotely and some actually participating here from the Chamber. This is the first hybrid meeting that we've held of the Economy Committee with additional people beyond the Chair, so I'm hoping that having that mixture is going to work out well. Today's meeting is going to be focusing on the impact of COVID-19 and the impact it's had on London's high streets. We started discussing high streets before COVID really hit, and we were just in the process of finalising a report on what we thought some recommendations to the Mayor and potentially to government might be to help struggling high streets. However, of course, since COVID, things have changed dramatically in many parts of life, not least the way in which people are shopping and the use of the high street. So we paused that report, and this is now a follow-up to the meeting that we held in January 2020. And we're going to try and incorporate some further thoughts that now take on the subsequent impact caused by the virus. We encourage everybody who's interested in this area, very important area, to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtags Assembly Economy or hashtag COVID Recovery. We've got a few short items of formal business to go through first before we move on to that discussion, particularly with our expert guests. And I'd now like to ask the committee clerk, Lauren, to confirm the names of the Assembly members who are present at this meeting, either in the Chamber or virtually, and to confirm whether we have any apologies for absence. Lauren.
Thank you, Chair. The following members are currently present on this call. In the Chamber, we have yourself, the Chair, Assembly Member Cooper, Assembly Member Qureshi and Assembly Member Russell. Participating remotely, we have the Deputy Chairman, Assembly Member Bailey, Assembly Member Desai and Assembly Member Hall. So we've received no apologies for absence.
Thanks very much, Lauren. The next item of business is item number 2, which is declarations of interest, which are found on pages 1 to 4 of your agenda pack. Could I ask members to note the list of appointments set out at item 2?
Noted.
And could I just ask if anyone has got any further interests that they need to declare? I'm not seeing any nodding. Okay, we'll move on to item 3. Item 3 is the minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 4th of August 2020, and the minutes are found at pages 5 to 44 in your agenda pack. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of August? And there is actually one amendment. The minutes previously said that this meeting would be on the 28th of September, although obviously we are meeting today. That is what we said at the time. So could I ask if everyone is prepared to agree those minutes?
Agreed. Agreed.
Thank you. The next item is item 4, which is the summary list of actions, which is found on pages 45 to 54 of your agenda pack. Can we note the completed and the outstanding actions from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 5 is action taken under delegated authority, found on pages 55 to 62. I'd like to ask members of the committee, can we note the recent action taken by me as chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members, which has been to agree the committee's response to the Parliamentary Bays Committee's inquiry on post-pandemic growth. Is that agreed to note that?
Noted.
Noted? Thank you. Which brings us on to item 6, and which is the item where we will be hearing from our expert guests, and we move into our discussion on COVID-19 and the high street. There's been a report which has been circulated, and all members of the committee have received a detailed briefing on this item, bringing us all up to date on the latest issues. I'd now like to welcome our guests who have joined us today, and thank you very much for being here. The first of our guests is the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipe. You're very welcome, Jules. We also have Patrick Dubec, who is the Interim Head of Regeneration at the GLA. Very welcome, Patrick. We also have Gianluca Rizzo, who's the manager of the Stratford Original Bid and the Brixton Bid. You're very welcome, Gianluca. And we also have Dominic Curran, who is the policy advisor to the British Retail Consortium. Thank you very much for all joining us now. And I would also just point out that Kate Nichols, who's the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality, who's going to be joining us slightly later in the session, I believe about 11 a.m. If we move on, we're going to start with some questions from me. And I'd like to start by asking Gianluca and Dominic, first of all, and that's what have been the biggest threats to the high street prior to COVID-19? And I think you can probably guess what one of my subsequent questions might be as well. So if I start with Gianluca first.
Good morning, Chair. Thanks for having me. And I have to start with an apology. I've got my son who is just over 3 years at home with me today. So if there is some background noise, you're going to have to excuse me. I have the pleasure of running these two bids, Stratford and Brixton, and very different. So I guess my views are kind of been informed by these two places that kind of are placed in this kind of space in between inner and outer London. In terms of, to answer your question, in terms of, the challenges, of course, they're kind of, the usual ones, I guess, business rates is, of course, the highest challenge that businesses have been facing before COVID. I think particularly in a place like Brixton, with the revaluation that took place probably 3 years ago now, we've seen an average increase of 60%. So that added a major financial pressure on the vast majority of our businesses. In Stratford, the increase was slightly less high. I think the average increase was around 30%, but again, fairly high increase compared to a number of high streets. High rent, of course, is always, the second most important challenge that businesses have been facing, and again, Brixton particularly, also because it's becoming a very popular destination for business, but also for residents that are moving into the area. And then the other two, I guess, main challenges have been the growth of online shopping, and of course the large malls that have been built in and around London, I think actually it's fair to say that in a place like Stratford, for example, and for those of you who are not familiar with the bid area, we cover the original side of Stratford, so the actual town centre, and we don't cover Westfield. We have a good neighbouring relationship with them, but since the Westfield has been opened, the footfall actually has been increased over the town centre side. So I think it's fair to say that it's not necessarily a negative impact. However, of course, when a place like Stratford with very good transport links becomes, of course, a very attractive price, of course, we've seen an increase of rent. So I guess this kind of in a way sets the scene for kind of the challenges. And also, if I may, also like a final comment is my personal view. I'm Italian. I've been in London 13 years now, and I consider myself a Londoner. But in my view, looking at it from a more, I guess, European perspective, I think over the 90s and 2000s, the UK have gone from massive growth of retail. So there's been over retail. So I guess some of the challenges that actually high streets have been facing over the last 20 or so years has also been, in my view, down to that issue of over retail. So I think the transformation, I guess, of high streets have been happening for a few years now. With COVID, of course, maybe speeding up this process. And I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you, Gianluca. That's a really good beginning. Dominic, is there anything that you would pull out that would be different from that you would like to add to that, or just to amplify the particular issues that Gianluca's just been focusing on?
Thanks, Chair. I would echo what Gianluca said in essence, although I would pull out his first comment, which is that of business rates. Retail pays about 25% of the business rates bill, but only accounts for 10% also pays 10% of business taxes, but only accounts for about 5% of the economy by GVA. So retail is particularly overtaxed, particularly on business rates, and that is what is really driving a lot of the decisions that retailers are having to make at the moment about, unfortunately, closing stores and making staff redundant. And as Gianluca says, COVID has accelerated, highlighted, amplified a lot of these pre-COVID trends. But the really big problem has been business rates, and we've seen a business rate multiplier that has risen from 34p when it was introduced in 1990 to 51p now. We do have a government that is committed to a review, and the first objective of that review is to reduce the overall burden. So I think that's very welcome, and it's a good recognition of the problem that business rates poses. But ultimately, we've had a situation that has been persisting for decades, frankly, that has meant that physical space has been overtaxed, frankly, and retail physical space has been particularly overtaxed. So if we can sort out the business rates problem, a lot of the other problems will I think, be easier to resolve.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you both what pre-COVID challenges need to be addressed to ensure a positive recovery for London's high streets. Well, I'm hearing a very strong message about the review of business rates there. In terms of whether or not you think that high streets were sufficiently resilient, whether or not the previous challenges that they'd been facing, do you think that when the crisis hit that has particularly been damaging for high streets, just because there was this list of issues that we'd already been looking at as a committee, and we know that high streets have been experiencing? Do you think that left high streets particularly vulnerable to the impact of COVID? I'll start with Dominic and then see if Gianluca wants to add anything.
I mean, I don't know how resilient you can be in the context of a global pandemic that happens once every 100 years. You'd have to build in an exceptional level of kind of economic buffer to completely resist that. High streets were suffering from a lot of things. I think there are things that were issues outside of business rates before COVID, and which will remain issues, but will probably come into sort of starker relief and need more attention, such as things like the way the use class order system works, flexibility in planning, and maybe some greater flexibility in allowing new businesses to start to open up in spaces that will inevitably be vacated by stores closing down. And it will probably accelerate some of the discussion around what sort of uses we want to see in our high streets and town centres, whether that's a return of public services after the decamping from town centres over the 90s, or a mix of uses such as housing, but obviously done in a properly managed way, not in a sort of free-for-all permitted development right way. So I think it is bringing those debates back to the fore. But I don't know how resilient a high street really could have been realistically been expected to be in the face of what's been happening.
Would you agree with that, Gianluca, then, that it's pretty impossible to be resilient in the face of a global pandemic? I mean, I just think that some of the things that we'd been looking at did make the high streets, they were already very challenged, weren't high streets, I think.
Yeah, and also I think the only thing to add from my perspective as a bit professional, I guess, is that we also look at high street from a sector point of view and from an almost individual point of view as a business. So my point may be, and I'm sure that some of my businesses might not necessarily like what I was going to say, what I'm about to say, but the point is also what COVID has put into kind of sharp focus is that some businesses maybe have outdated business model, I guess, and I think this crisis is actually to a certain extent challenging business owners and entrepreneurs to kind of rethink the way they're doing business. As in fact, is a positive example, I guess, is some businesses have totally embraced an online presence and a digital offer, switching this business model. So maybe one of the kind of call for support that maybe we can be made is around actually providing that individual support for businesses that maybe are struggling to think outside the box to review their business model, but to have that kind of direct support for them, I guess.
Yes, I think some people have moved more quickly to have a parallel online offer, and also I think the click and collect market has been very helpful for some as well. I just want to move on to Jules and Patrick now, because I'd like to ask a question about the Mayor. How active do you think the Mayor has been in addressing the challenges that have previously been highlighted to the committee in our previous meetings and also just in the last few minutes. And obviously, actually, we were just having a sort of the reference to PDR, permitted development rights, and the idea of some sort of free-for-all. Do you think the Mayor has been active in addressing that issue and also rising business costs?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to start really by confirming everything that Dominic and Gianluca have said. We definitely recognise that as being, you know, the situation that businesses have been facing for a long time. But of course, it goes back further than sort of the issues they've been facing over the last 5-10 years or so. If you think of the sort of the 80s and 90s and the rise of you know, out of centre retail, leisure and office parks in the 90s, we had the rise of mega stores, the sort of the Tesco Extra, and then web-based retail starting you know, 10 years ago. I think perhaps rather than resilient, perhaps adaptable is a word I'd use over the last 150 years for our high streets. They're unrecognisable from when they were in Victorian times, similarly in the 20s, the 50s, the 60s. And one of the principal strands of work that the Mayor's been having us all working on is about you know, looking at adaptive strategies and working with boroughs to adopt adaptive strategies for high streets. You know, you can't sit Canute-like and ignore a rising tide or a changing tide in this case of the way things are operating and the way people are choosing. You know, to consumer demand changes, expectations about products, greater choice, and experiences as well. High streets and town centres need to adapt now more towards providing a particular shopper experience rather than simply providing people with objects in bags to leave the shops with, because people, as we know, and your other guests have said, are increasingly looking to online for that. So that's certainly what we've been looking at in terms of the Good Growth Fund in City Hall on behalf of the Mayor, and we've put significant funding into town centre projects, both into the built fabric, but also in looking at ways of bringing on whether it's shared workspaces, co-working spaces, or improving, you know, the civic spaces. And we've a number of projects that we could talk you through that we've been looking at. On the issue of PD rights, that is a real challenge, I think. The use, I would agree with someone who'd say planning shouldn't be inflexible. When you had people opening bike shops and then wanting to diversify, saying, actually, let's make this more of an experience, let's sell coffee too, it's very unhelpful if a planning officer would say, well, you're mixing use classes there and we're going to have to take enforcement action. There needed to be that degree of flexibility. If it's saying, let's take all the A1 to A5 use classes and B1C and scrap them all and stick them all in an E-use class, I disagree with that, because then that's a free-for-all. And I do think that in a time of great change, I'm not talking about COVID now, I'm talking about pre-COVID, I think there is a real role for bids and boroughs and community groups to come together to curate a space, to have that kind of desirable mix of an offer that attracts people into a locality. I think having a sort of a free-for-all, lowest common denominator approach where, you know, people can just maximise their rental income and go to the highest payer is not necessarily going to lead to attractive, welcoming high streets and town centres that people are going to want to spend time in, and that's what we need to be creating. And then finally on business rates, yes, I mean that point was well made by both Dominic and Gianluca. it has risen phenomenally, and now it's seen as by the government as a significant way to fund local services.
I mean, I take your point about planning being a bit inflexible, because I think we've probably all experienced that at some point or another, but I also take your point about the idea of the local authority having the role in curating an attractive high street so that people will not want to do all their shopping online, but do the click online and then come and collect and have a sort of an enjoyable experience and all the things that people are looking for. And I do think there is an issue that has come up several times previously, which I think has led to some of the controls, which I think we've all possibly experienced and lots of people complain about, which is one estate agent moves in and then 100 estate agents move in, and there's a whole section of the street is only filled with estate agents, which isn't really a shopping opportunity unless unless you want to move house. And the other one that people complain about has been when there's been one arcade with slot machines, and then you suddenly end up with a whole road filled with 10 or 15, and if you're interested in gambling, then it's a great place to go, but for anyone else, it's not really so attractive. So do you think it's about the balance between getting the planning system to stop that kind of proliferation, but at the same time allowing the flexibility and the curating that you were referring to?
That's absolutely right. Because you can have even too much of a good thing. I mean, I've known roads become overwhelmed with restaurants, and to the frustration of not just locals who want to go out and buy a pint of milk, but it can be dead at other times of the day if really the restaurant trade's really only doing in a particular sort of out of centre area, sort of zone 2, zone 3. Those kind of streets that have become dominated by restaurants are really only well used in the evening rather than daytime, particularly if they've squeezed out all the other uses that would supply passing trade during a lunchtime. So yes, so even positive additions to a high street, you can have too much of them squeezing out the variety that make places vibrant and make them as an ecosystem, because businesses depend on other businesses either to support them and supply them, or for the customers themselves, the passing trade.
I have to say I'd rather a high street overwhelmed with restaurants than one overwhelmed with estate agents, but I mean that's just a personal feeling. I just wondered if I could ask you about the mayor and lobbying the government on the issue of business rates for high street retailers. I mean, I really take Dominic's point about over taxation. How important do you think it is that we get this right for the regeneration of the many high streets that we have? 1,200, more than 1,200 in London. That we get the business rates review done properly.
I think it's key. It's something that the mayor's been lobbying about. I think I'm safe in saying the entire mayoralty. We could probably supply quite a list of the times that it's been mentioned in documents that have been sent to the government, both not just in response to consultations on this, but as a key plank in asks of the government to address this. And this is both in the central activity zone, but also right across London to outer London. And there's a whole series of sophisticated asks that we have had, or suggestions that we've seen elsewhere that we would support. There have been recommendations to the government that in Scotland they've adopted on moving the thresholds for small business rate relief, but sadly they haven't been enacted in England.
That's interesting. And Patrick, do you want to add anything to any of the areas that Jules has just covered to amplify or to extend?
I suppose one area I might just pick up on is the impact of online retail and how significant that is to the success and viability of high streets. We saw a big shift in online retail from about, it's risen to about 20% of retail take, and it's risen higher during COVID. And the mayor has welcomed the government putting forward a digital sales tax proposition. And we await more detail on that, because it doesn't form a huge part of the consultation on business rates that is live at the minute. I think it's disappointing that it doesn't seem to indicate that any of the digital sales tax levy will be collected locally, so local authorities won't have a role. And that's something that the Mayor would support.
So when you say collected locally, do you mean that a certain amount of the digital sale tax should come back to supporting the work of local authorities in supporting high streets, that sort of thing?
Yes, if a digital sales tax is going to help redress as Dominic pointed out, the imbalanced tax regime which hampers the ability of bricks and mortar to compete, then a digital sales tax would benefit local areas by redistributing some of that income to local authorities.
Right, rather than just going straight back into the government, you'd like to see it coming locally. Okay, I think I understand the point.
Or at the very least, a pro rata decrease in business rates. It could be redistributed in that way and relief to small businesses. As I say, in Scotland, they've raised the relief to I think £15,000 now for small businesses.
Okay, so there's quite a lot of different strategies that can be looked at there. So I'm sure that's something that the committee will want to comment on. Thank you all very much.
Chair, sorry, do you mind if I just come in on
Yeah,
that,
sure,
please?
please do, Dominic.
So we're in danger of conflating a number of issues here. We have a digital services tax, not sales tax, which has been introduced essentially by government, and that's essentially an answer to the issue of profit shifting across different international jurisdictions. It's essentially an answer to international taxation and corporate taxation and how you tackle taxing the profits made by companies that work across several different jurisdictions. That's entirely different to the high street debate and the debate about an online sales tax, not services tax. An online sales tax, as mooted insofar it has been mooted in the government's consultation, would be a terrible, terrible thing for the retail sector as a whole. It would be a tax by definition that would be levied 100% on the retail sector. It's a digital sales tax. Slightly different if we're looking about a tax on any purchase of any service made online, but that's not generally what is mooted. What's mooted is a tax on the sale of goods online. So you have a situation where you'll have a tax which is 100% levied on retail, and more particularly on consumers, not actually on retail per se, but on customers. And even if used to offset the business rates take, and the Treasury doesn't like hypothecating taxes, but assuming we could get over that hurdle, let's say it was raised, it was set at a 2% level, which is what was mooted in the papers recently. That would raise on current internet sales numbers about £2 billion. Even if that 2 billion was used to offset the 32 billion raised through business rates, as I said before, retail pays 1/4 of the business rates bill. Assuming that there wasn't an ability to give it entirely to the retail sector, and there's a huge state aid question about whether that would even be legally possible, assuming therefore that it was used to offset business rates uniformly, that would be a 2 billion offset to the 32 billion bill, and retail would, as it were, sort of benefit only 1/4 of that because retail pays 1/4 of the bill. So you would have a situation where retail pays a £2 billion tax and gets £500 million back as a sector. As an answer to the problem of the retail sector and high streets, it's perverse.
Okay, so I gather from what you're saying then you would not necessarily be massively in favour of this at all.
If we were, we would be the only trade body that argued for another tax on its own members.
Okay, thank you. That's been a very helpful beginning to the discussion. I'm now going to move on to my colleague Unmesh Desai. Assemblymember Desai is going to ask about the challenges faced by high streets during the course of the pandemic, and I'm going to pass over to him now for his questions. So, Unmesh. You need to unmute yourself, I think. I think I'm going to say that a few times today.
I do apologize. This always happens. I should be used to it by now. Anyway, good morning to the panel. Before I ask my questions about the effect of COVID-19 on London's high streets, a very general question to you, Patrick, and Jules, you might want to come in. But it's obviously important to collect data to get evidence to formulate proper strategies. So what is the role of GN economics in this respect? What sort of data do you collect on the state and health of our high streets in London?
At a micro level, the data collection issue is something where across London we think there's real room for improvement. In the report that we put out at the beginning of the year, the Adaptive High Streets report, there was a recommendation in there that the pooling and aggregating of data across London's local authorities, across London's high streets, would be of real value to helping it provide a real-time picture that local places could access, retailers could access and understand. So currently the picture of data collection at a local authority level is dependent on who they commission to pull it together for them. So vacancy rate data tends not to be particularly dynamic, but most local authorities will have a handle on vacancy data. It's not something that is uniformly aggregated at a city level. And one of the proposals that we are developing at the minute is a data store type bolt-on that's really focused on high street health, looking at things like footfall data, looking at things like vacancy rate data that's aggregated, and there's a sort of a collective bargaining position, if you like, among local authorities where we can pull that together more comprehensively and create some standardization which informs policy. So there is data, but it varies from place to place, and the methodology for collecting it is contingent on the local conditions and how it's set.
Jules, have you got anything to add to that? Yeah, you don't have to, but no.
No.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a subject area in its own right, and I could go on, and I won't. I'll just make one point. You talked about variation between, in terms of how the data is collected, different methodologies. But even within a place itself, say a particular borough, like Newham, what I'm concerned about is how the data is collected among, say, really small businesses. So you've got the British Retail Consortium, and they do the large stores and so on. And it's really getting down to the basic, on the high street, the small shops, the corner shops. Do they have the chance to get their experiences inputted into the making of into the data that's collected, the formula strategies? I suspect not. I mean, do you have anything to comment on that? Could we actually improve in that aspect?
We absolutely could. I mean, I think there's a lot, as I say, that independents, local retailers could benefit from having access to sort of live, real-time data through sort of accessible dashboards that are collected and collated at a local level. And there's a whole digitisation agenda for sort of independent retail and small businesses on the high street that is really important as well.
Okay, yeah, we could go on about this. So to come to the high street itself, so really my questions are about the problems. There will be questions from my colleagues in due course about, more importantly, what can be done about the problems that the high street faces. And we know that the picture is bleak. I mean, our briefing paper tells us that the Centre for Cities High Streets Recovery Tracker ranks London last out of all London cities and towns analysed by the tracker in terms of the extent to which high street activity has returned to pre-pandemic levels for both footfall and spend. So can you tell us how have London's high streets been particularly affected by COVID? Who are the winners and losers on the high street? And very specifically, how will increased home working affect the high street? So the effect on the high streets, winners and losers, and the effects of working from home. I'm sorry, that question is to Gianluca and Dominic, very specifically. Or those questions rather, sorry. Gianluca?
I think Gianluca's on mute now.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, yeah. Okay, well, big questions, of course. I think, again, geographically I represent Brixton and Stratford. As I mentioned earlier, they don't really fit in outer and inner London. So, of course, my understanding is that the impact on, let's call it footfall and I guess working from home has been much greater in central London, in like more traditional office locations versus these, I guess, outer London locations like Stratford and Brixton. Incidentally, in both locations, we currently, footfall data shows that we are around 30% less compared to a year ago or so. And I believe it's pretty much in line with the national figure, just to kind of put things in perspective. In terms of, the facts, of course, I guess one of the traditional measure around successful high streets, I guess, is footfall. So of course, during the lockdown, we've seen none, and I guess we're starting to see people, coming back to it. So of course, that's been the biggest impact. And I think, the main one that, we have experienced is actually, of course, the reduced capacity. So I think, for me, the way in which I was thinking about the impact of COVID on business has been almost like within their own premises, almost like indoor and outdoor. So that's the kind of way I was trying to think about it. So with indoor, I guess, with social distancing measures in place within the premises, we've seen overall a reduced capacity, and I'm referring particularly to the hospitality industry with, restaurants, pubs and bars. So they're operating at a 50% capacity, which means they're operating with 50% less staff, just to use this figure, which means that, we're going to be dealing with, high numbers of unemployment, probably in October once the Furlough scheme ends, I guess. So, that's, in my view, the most alarming and the most pressing issues that we might have. Working from home, I guess, is the second, biggest impact. Of course, it's kind of it's not as serious, I guess, for places like Stratford and Brixton, but it definitely had an impact because, both locations actually have a fairly good office presence. We've got the town halls, we've got a number of larger employers both in Stratford and Brixton. So what we have seen is that a number of businesses that relied on that daytime trade and lunch trade actually are very quiet, with some of them actually speaking to me. They said they're not going to reopen completely, so they just literally gone out of business. So that's, of course, the second effect. And then I guess that, of course, is all linked to consumer confidence, which in London, for whatever reason, is particularly low, I guess. And then finally, I guess, to try and address, the winners and losers, I don't know, I feel, the vast majority probably are losers, unless, as a bit the comment that I made earlier, unless they were able to adapt very, very quickly to that online and digital offer. So maybe the local grocer that before was relying on the kind of, walk-in trade, maybe now they've come up with those, little, packs that, are being delivered on a bicycle, for example. So it's very much on a, one-to-one basis, and, those business owners that were quickly able to react and adapt to the changing economic landscape, I guess.
Dominic?
Thank you. I'd say there's probably two halves to this answer. The first is to break down what's happening in London in a kind of geographic and then a sub-sectoral sense in retail terms. It was interesting to hear Gianluca's numbers on footfall, because our data suggests that London as a whole, and that's quite a large variety of areas, has had a 45% fall in footfall last month compared to August last year. And that's set against the UK average of 35%. So it's been a bigger drop. I suspect that 45% increases to something well over 50 once you get into the very centre, with perhaps some slight exceptions for particular shopping areas. Maybe Oxford Street hasn't been quite so bad, but in general terms, I suspect it's a higher drop in the centre and a lower drop, if indeed any drop at all, in the extreme outer suburbs. And back in June, I was aware that places like Bromley and Upminster had actually seen an increase in footfall compared to the previous year, but I suppose that reflected the fact that people were staying in their local areas rather than travelling into the centre. And then sort of overarching that, you have in retail a sectoral breakdown where fashion, particularly footwear, is doing really, really badly. There are some, bright spots in that bleak picture, but in general terms, fashion is doing pretty badly. But grocery is doing relatively well, and that reflects partly the fact that people are staying home rather more, eating out rather less, so they're buying more food at home, It reflects the fact that grocery has been open this whole period, and so it's done relatively well. So we need to be aware of that sort of breakdown. And in terms of retail, food to go has done pretty badly in the centre of London. Pret, which is I think 75% of its stores are in London, they're closing a number of them in the centre. We've had other members tell us that their central London coffee shop and food to go stores are trading at something like 30% of their normal volumes, whereas in the suburbs it's more like 70 to 80. For many of them they need to operate at 90% to even break even, so it's still not good, but it's better in the suburbs and out London than inner London. And then overarching that, to echo again John Luca's point, I think there's 4 reasons why London, central London's suffering particularly, and that is obviously the complete, almost virtual sort of drop-off of tourist trade, international travel, obviously people working from home, obviously the limitations and concerns about public transport capacity and safety. I think the New West End company said that something like 98% of their visitors arrive by public transport. I doubt this is doing very much for the West End, although there are flagship stores which to an extent will counter things. And actually, just to slightly give the counter argument to the online offer, it was striking that Primark, which doesn't have an online offer, when shops were able to reopen, had phenomenal trade in its Oxford Street stores. So there was almost a kind of reverse online effect where actually people did go because they couldn't go online. When you have a particularly good offer like Primark does for its customer base, I think you see the effects there. And then I think there's the overarching that there's the sort of the broader economic confidence. We're seeing the furlough scheme beginning to unwind. We'll be seeing, I think, a lot of unemployment coming forward and happening over the coming months, and I think people are going to be unwilling to spend in that context of uncertainty.
Both of you actually mentioned the furlough scheme, and I was going to ask you about that. Is there a case for extending the furlough scheme?
Unmesh, I don't like to stop you in your prime, but we are going to come to some questions on government measures to support people during the pandemic, which I believe Assembly Member Susan Hall is going to be asking rather than you.
Chair, I was just going to say, the gist of my question was actually how people who are, say, in the aviation sector, that if they lose their jobs, it affects spending in the community and in the local high street. So I think, well, if you want to raise it later, but I think I already made the point that, the aviation industry, for instance, Heathrow, communities around Heathrow rely on people working at the airport, and obviously if they lose their jobs, then clearly spending the high street is affected, and that's why I wanted to ask the question now. And there is a case, I would say, just like Unite GMB, the union that I belong to, have been asking for this furlough scheme to be extended to help local communities by keeping those jobs.
Well, maybe...
I'll ask the question, I also answered it. Thank you.
Yes, you have. But I'm sure Assembly Member Hall will ask further questions about furlough and other government initiatives as well. I'm going to move on then. Thank you very much, Unmesh, for completing your area. The next question is going to come from Assembly Member Murad Qureshi, and very welcome to see you in the chamber. I'm not sitting here by myself as I have for the last 2 meetings. Pass over to you for the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And can I also remind yourself, we've also got Caroline Russell here.
Well, I'm going to introduce her when
later.
we come
Sorry,
to Caroline.
yes, of course. Sorry, I've taken that prompt away from you. Yes, can I just come back to the questioning? I just wanted to touch on the differences between inner and outer London and ask our panel of experts, are inner London high streets and outer London high streets being affected in different ways by the COVID recession? And if so, do they require different support measures? Can I start with Jules?
I think it's less inner and outer rather than local versus central, and so slightly more subtle. I think, as you heard from Dominic, some of the outer London suburbs, though, are perhaps seeing a bigger boost. But I think we can all see more activity on our local high streets throughout the day than there was previously, because people are working from home. But it's contrasts greatly, obviously, with the activity within the centre. those parades of shops and whether it be sort of passing trade type sort of prep operations or whatever, or whether they're multiples or whether they're independents. If they're in the centre, then clearly it's a completely different story to the localities outside that are more residential.
Okay. Well, thank you for the distinction, actually, being more local versus central. I think that is useful in light of all the town centres we have clearly in Greater London. Can I just come to Patrick and wondered if he's got any thoughts on this as well?
If I go, I guess, slightly further, and I think the data suggests that if you take on a sliding scale, you can see that out-of-town centres have returned to the sorts of patronage, footfall that they would have seen pre-COVID much quicker. District centres have performed slightly worse. Metropolitan centres have performed worse again, so the larger scale town centres in London. And then the international centres, if you like, so in the West End, as we've already indicated, is still continuing to perform worst in terms of returning to trend. So there's a clear picture.
Inverse proportion to their size, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And Giuliano, do you have any views?
With regards to Stratford and Brixton specifically.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
With regards to Stratford and Brixton,
yeah.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I guess a place like Brixton relies a little bit more on the residential community. So I guess the impact has been kind of leveled up a little bit by people working from home and Ezra. Sorry, apologies. Paw Patrol is a very exciting, more exciting activity for you. Yeah, so definitely in a place like Ezra. In a place like Brixton, the residents have kind of come locally and spend. Stratford is slightly different because it's actually also a destination, because of Westfield. So I think the impact on has been greater. I guess I don't know if I've answered the question, but yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the observations I would like to make is that I think certainly our high streets, which have street markets as well, I think have been hit because the market traders on street markets haven't been, in some ways, been a target for the government support. Is there anything we can do on that front to assist our street markets throughout London? Or have we just missed them altogether when we're looking at high streets?
No, I mean, we do a lot of work on markets, street and covered markets. Jules chairs the market board that we convene at City Hall. So we've been doing a lot of work with market traders and market associations, gathering data on how they're impacted. I mean, I think one of the things that everyone's acknowledged is that some of the government support measures have not supported freelancers and the self-employed in the way that the other larger scale measures have provided protections to employees of organisations, and that has an impact on the markets. Lots of those people are self-employed and independent retailers who aren't able to access the same level of support. And I guess something I would add is the impact of other uses beyond retail as well, supporting the vitality of high streets and town centres. So we've talked a lot about retail in this conversation, but there's an awful lot of uses on the high street that have struggled in exactly the same ways, if not worse ways, than retail. So the culture and creative industries, the hospitality industries have been impacted worse than retail in many respects, but they're all part of the sort of the vitality. So they all work in a sort of an ecosystem where they support the viability of other uses. And when you see the sorts of uses that communities use, rely on, attract people to town centres, so cultural uses, theatres, bars, pubs, nightclub venues, when they are not operating, when they're not able to operate, then we see lots of our town centres really, really struggle. And I think that is an additional factor that's demonstrating why you're seeing some of the out-of-town retail centres begin to return to norm, but actually some of our more significant centres where you get a concentration of those other uses, that mix of use, perform less well because they're reliant on all of those uses working in harmony, and some of them are well below capacity necessarily.
Thank you. Patrick, I just want to emphasise with the government support that actually London small businesses haven't done very well because of the business rate thresholds. Actually, ironically, places like Wigan have been getting more assistance that way than my home borough in the City of Westminster, when only 14% of the small business owners that you have on the high street and street markets have been eligible for that. Is there any way of compensating for that in a London Pacific way? Patrick?
I mean, it's difficult. We've outlined that the flat rate for business rate relief is a problem for London. Jules has pointed out that in Scotland the higher rate provides the ability and scope to support small businesses to a greater degree. As you say, places in Wigan and wherever the cost of doing business is the land cost of doing business are much lower. The business rate levy is the same. I think the local authorities have done a good job in deploying the additional emergency relief that the government's made available. So I think 90% of all the additional grant funding that was made available to local authorities has now been paid out to small businesses across London, and that has been a support to small businesses, and there's been an element of discretionary ability for local authorities to target it to the businesses that they see locally suffering worst. But clearly there are gaps, and we've talked about the gaps in the freelance and self-employed end of the spectrum, but there are some small businesses that fall outside or in between classes or distinctions that are really struggling, and I'm sure we've all come across them.
Yes, I fear we're going to lose a lot of small businesses through the COVID recession, and the point you're making, Patrick, is quite clear. Can I just end on this area of question by the local authorities and what they're doing? You're right. I think they've been very good at getting those that could get the business business rate grants. It's just that there seems to be different ways that different local authorities are supporting, let's say, street markets. It's evident to me that the Royal Borough of Kensington Chelsea is clearly supporting their street markets, whilst those in Westminster aren't getting the support that their neighbours next door are. Is there things that can be done on that front? Patrick?
I'm not familiar with the sort of the difference in approach that those boroughs might be taking. We can go away and look at that and provide a bit more detail. But we are doing a lot of work to support market authorities, local authorities, and private market operators to sort of share good practice and help signpost them to the sort of mechanisms that local authorities are making available to support street trading and markets. As I say, I don't have a great deal of insight into the particular circumstances in KNC or Westminster, but we can certainly try and find out a bit more if that would be of use.
Thank you. I'll end
Okay,
there.
so thanks very much for volunteering to come back to us with a bit more detail on that then, Patrick. And that might also be something that we want to make a recommendation about when we finally come to that point, if there's very different ways of supporting coming from lots of different boroughs. Because I certainly know that one of the things boroughs have been saying to me is they feel they've been working together very successfully, and there's been a bit of a sort of trying to have a level playing field approach, but it seems from what you're saying that perhaps doesn't apply in some areas. The next set of questions is going to come from Assembly Member Susan Hall, who may potentially have a bit of a follow-up to the line of questioning that Assembly Member Mirai Qureshi was just following, but if not, we'll just go straight on into her questions. Susan.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll ask the first one, if I may, to Dominic. Given that areas in the West End are still facing a significantly lower footfall than before the pandemic, what steps do you think the Mayor can take to make Londoners feel safer travelling into London?
Good question. I think to an extent it's out of the Mayor's hands. The things that will make people feel safer are to do with the UK's response as a whole to the safety concerns that COVID-19 throw up. you know, there could be greater marketing, I suppose, of you know the attractions and merits of going into London. But as Patrick has said, you know, while a lot of the cultural offer still remains effectively closed, you know, there may well be a limit to how much of a draw that would be. I mean, it was striking to note the real success of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. I have wondered whether, you know, slightly, perhaps not entirely seriously, whether, you know, giving everybody 50% off their retail purchases for the month of September might be a worthwhile thing to do. But I think one thing that would really help would actually be, given the concerns that people will have about using public transport, or even the ability to use public transport given capacity constraints, whether there could be something to be done on parking and the congestion charge. And I know that, you know, councils make about £1 billion nationally out of council car park fees across England and Wales. I think if there was a government effective sort of subsidy, either full or part, for the month or two in the run-up to Christmas, which is obviously the golden quarter for retail, when many retailers actually turn their profit for the year, then something like that encourage people to come in, encourage people to spend, might actually make a meaningful difference in the centre of London, and would enable people to get out of their local neighbourhoods, however lovely they may be, for the rest of the year. I think people may need that extra incentive to go and park in, to go and travel into the sort of busier, more metropolitan type of centres that Patrick was talking about. So I think, if not a reassurance, then certainly an incentive to use, to get out and to shop in other areas might be something that the Mayor could do, or certainly put pressure on boroughs to do, and on government to help subsidise. And frankly, in terms of the cost, nationally, that would be about £80 to £100 million a month. That's 1/5 of the 1 month Eat Out to Help Out scheme. And I think from what our members say, the lure of free parking is an almost disproportionately powerful one for consumers and shoppers.
Yes, okay. I mean, you did say it's out of the Mayor's hands, but of course he is directly responsible for TfL. So we mustn't forget that with getting people in there. And you say 50% discount on retail. Who would you think would pay for that?
Well, I mean, it was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it was clear that there are government schemes that can be, you know, that can be done to incentivise people to get out, and in that case, eat in restaurants. But I'm talking about specifically going to visit their local high streets, and if it's not a sort of subsidised purchase of goods, which I'm not really advocating, I think effectively a subsidised trip to retail centres or to shopping centres and town centres would be an incredibly powerful thing that would probably get people out and visiting those places that have been suffering over the past 6 months.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned earlier that shoe shops are suffering. I'd be very happy for anybody to subsidise me 50% of shoes. I'd be there like a shot. But we need to be really concentrating on what the Mayor can do. I mean, you're saying about the government providing money for various things. What do you think the Mayor should be providing money for? He has got an £18.6 billion budget. So where do you think he should be putting his money?
I mean, I'm not familiar with all the detail of the Mayor's powers and ability to spend. I think that 18 billion is largely taken up by TfL's operating costs. So, I don't think it's quite appropriate to suggest he's got 18 billion pounds to spend on business subsidies or transport incentives like free parking, which is largely in the borough's control. TfL, as far as I know, don't do much parking outside of the stations that they operate. So I think it probably shows up part of the constraints of the various GLA acts that don't actually give the Mayor very much power to do a lot of things. So I'll leave it to others who are more informed about London politics to suggest what the Mayor should do. All I would say is that the things that I think need to be done to get people visiting town centres and high streets are to reduce and reform business rates and to incentivise in the sort of slightly medium to long term, but also to continue the business rate relief in the shorter term post-April, and also to incentivise people to get out there, which would, in the context of public transport capacity constraints, be about making parking easier and access easier.
Yeah, it's a shame, isn't it, that we don't have access to a magic money tree, because that would assist us all getting out of this dreadful situation the pandemic has caused. We heard at the last economy meeting that an economic recovery strategy would be a priority for the Mayor. I don't know if I can have any update on this. We haven't had so far. Would you like to see the Mayor? What would you like to see the Mayor include in this strategy? I suppose I'd better go to Jules really on this one.
Yes, I mean the mayor's taking a number of different avenues to this. Clearly, co-chairing the recovery task force with the Secretary of State is about the immediate reopening of central London and restoring activity in a way that is that can work as best it can. There's also the task force that's chaired by Amy LeMay and Sophie Linden as well, looking at the safe reopening. Effectively, that's the tactical response to the board that the Mayor is chairing with the Secretary of State. In the more longer term, in economic recovery, which goes hand in hand with social recovery, we have the recovery task force, which again overseen by the Mayor, the task force board chaired by the Mayor's head of policy, and underneath that sits two strands of work. The economic recovery and the social recovery, but inevitably they're very much intertwined, and that's working very closely with all the boroughs, London councils, both its members and their chief executives are all represented in that. And I mean, if there was time, or we could supply you in writing with detail about the 8 strands of work that have been synthesised by that task force. That you may have seen recently that it was out to consultation about what civic society, the general public, business, all stakeholders thought about those 8 strands, and there was an endorsement that they saw those as a priority, as major contributors to the recovery of London.
Okay, so will there be a document saying the economic strategy, recovery strategy? Will there be something for us to look at and to judge you from?
Yes, I'm not overseeing its production, but I know that it is being produced by the Mayor's office that will tie it all together for publication.
Okay, who is overseeing that then?
Well, that'd be the Mayor's Director of Policy.
Okay, so any idea where we might get a glimpse of this?
I think it's imminent.
I think I was told that at the last Economies meeting. Well, we won't hold our breath, but we look forward to it. The Mayor said in the Evening Standard on Monday that Londoners are not stupid and warned of berating people to return to offices. So how do you think the Mayor can encourage Londoners to get back into central London and to help them feel safe?
Well, I mean, the Mayor's initiated strong campaigns in recently, as it has been possible. You know, there's something to go to, such as the Eat Out campaign and restaurants that encouraging people to understand, accept that the public transport is a safe way to travel, because TfL obviously have instigated a whole range of new cleaning, a new cleaning regime, additional cleaning, and deploying staff the right places to encouraging people to wear masks. So the issue, and obviously capacity of the tube, the potential capacity of the tube is now practically up to 100%. So in terms of minimising overcrowding, in minimising cleanliness, reassuring people of cleanliness about safe travel, the Mayor can do no more on public transport than that. We can't invent additional trains or additional tube lines. We'll always be able to do more, and I'm sure we will do more on campaigning to reassure people it's safe. but that's about the limit one can do with public transport. I think the key issue, though, is about this issue about the lack of people within the centre of London. Is that on the one hand, part of the government says that, well, people should be returning to the office, but on the other hand, part of the government is still quite clear that the guidance for offices is to maintain social distancing. And when one marks out offices to comply with that social distancing, they are at about 25 to 30% of their capacity. And at the extreme end, you have some employers telling their staff that if they use public transport, they will not be welcome back in the office for 14 days and will have to self-isolate. So if the potential audience for London's services and London's general economy, whether it be Pret or whether it be restaurants, whether it be a reopened cultural nightlife, it's short of 70% of its potential audience. And the mayor is not in control of social distancing within offices. They are following government guidelines, which deters 70% of office workers to come in. And with that diminished audience, London is suffering that drop. I think what intrigues me more than that, because that seems to me to be quite straightforward, is that once the social distancing it can be dropped within offices, and there is a greater number of people returning to London, I think the key, the existential threat that faces London is that many of the key things that make London the global city it is, particularly its culture, much of that will depend, and I think Dominic referred to this, about the 90%, that if businesses rely on about maintaining 90 to 95% of their turnover or footfall to be viable, and returning to work's a great success and gets to 90, there will still be huge business failure. And I think that's where we as a society, and certainly as a capital, should be turning our mind to, that, in a kind of early stages of transition, there are things the government can do and has been doing, such as the furlough scheme, which should be extended particularly for targeted areas. And so, there are kind of these short-term solutions we can put in now. But as I say, the existential threat to me is what for the long term, for the things that we really want to preserve, but actually have to find a new model, because we aren't going to get back up to 100%. Because let's face it, if we got up to 90% in a year's time, that would be seen as a huge success. But if we have theatres and the sort of social fabric of London, elements of it requiring 95%, then we have a serious problem. And we need to be turning our minds to that now, which is what the mayor is doing. And I think that's what we should all be concentrating on, because I think until we solve this solution of social distancing in offices, it's utterly pointless. It's shouting in the wind just to exhort people to go back to offices that their employers are telling them not to come to.
It's difficult to run.
Susan, sorry to interrupt you. Sean,
you always interrupt me.
Well, I'm terribly sorry, but Sean has indicated that he was very keen to come in on the back of Jules's remarks. Did you want to come in now, Sean, or did you want to wait until Susan has finished her questions? I can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Excuse me, I take my cue from Susan. If you want to keep going, Susan, please do, and I'll come in on the back of work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll finish this, and then Sean can come in before the third. Sorry, as I say, we all accept it's difficult, and please God, a vaccine comes through quickly, and we can all start to get back to some sort of normality. But some surveys have been done that have said that people are nervous about going on the trains. So don't you think that it actually hasn't helped that the mayor has been so slow to act on tube-related issues, which he has been right from the beginning?
No, I would disagree that he's been slow. I think he's been realistic and responsible.
Well, I'm sorry, the cleaning regimes you're talking about now should have been in the first place. Masks for his staff, except we could go on and on, but we're talking about economies. But I mean, in reality, he's dealing around the whole transport issues have not been as good as they should have been. But as we're talking, as you don't accept that, we'll have to move on from that. Do you want to come in, Sean, before my last question, or shall I finish my last question?
Why don't I come in now? So just a quick question to Jules. You made a comment about employers and how they're using their space, but of course that's not universal. Many employers are asking staff to come in, and surely the mayor's position should be, if you can provide a safe working space, I can provide safe transport, in you should come. Because as much as we talk about furlough, we all know that can't go on forever, and the only thing that can go on forever is to get London back moving. So where is the mayor on encouraging people who can do it safely to come in?
Well, I think the mayor has been clear about the safety of the tube, and as I say, publicising the cleaning regimes, which have been ramped up time and time again over recent, over the last 4 or 5 months. As soon as this began, things began to change, and as new products have been offered, they've been taken. I believe I'm given to understand that they've been taken up, and as I say, the cleaning regime has been transformed specifically to increase confidence in the travelling public. But I would be very interested to have examples. Obviously, I'm not asking you now, this is your committee, but outside of this committee, I would be very interested to know of examples where firms are struggling to get their staff in on the basis of the staff being reluctant to travel, as opposed to the firms not being able to provide the space.
Sorry, Jules, that's not the point I made. The point I'm making is your assessment and the mayor's assessment, written in several places, has been very doom and gloom, and as asking people to stay away in effect. And what I'm suggesting is, shouldn't the mayor be talking about the innovation that businesses are showing to get people in? I've spoken to a number of business leaders who are working sectors that don't traditionally use shift patterns, who have now changed shift patterns so staff can be in the office at different times to increase the capacity of whatever office they have. Why isn't the mayor talking about that? Why aren't you talking about that? This has been a very down in the mouth, terrorised, keep out of London's conversation. I think there should be something talking about, if you could make this journey safely, if you're an employer and you can provide a safe workspace, we should be doing that, because we all know in 6 to 8 months, or maybe even sooner, if we don't get working in London, we will have serious amounts of unemployment, some of which we could have mitigated if we took steps now.
Well, as I say, I think the mayor has been realistic and responsible. I mean, on being responsible, the mayor's message about don't travel was at a time when nationally it was don't travel. The mayor has that is when the mayor was totally in lockstep with the government, as far as, or perhaps even more so than the government, and wisely so, given what we saw with the first peak. But the mayor is not currently dissuading people to travel on the tube and buses. And as I say, public transport is clearly advertised as safe and open for use and operating at near to 100% of capacity. That is not the issue about people not being able to come to work. Overwhelmingly, it is the capacity of office spaces that we see a downturn. That we see such a downturn in the central activity zone.
I mean, thank you for your answer, Jules. But the point I was making wasn't about public transport. It's about the fact that yourself and the mayor are talking in ways of keeping people out of London who could possibly make the trip. That's the point I'm making. Chair, thank you. I'll hand back.
I think actually I'd like to bring in Assembly Member Umesh Desai, who's also now indicated he would like to come in on this set of questions. And I would also just remind Assembly members that it's 11:15, which means that Kate Nichols has now been able to join us. So if you want to put questions to her, you can. And also, can I suggest that as soon as Umesh has asked his question, made his point, that we go back to the briefing, because we don't seem to have started the third section of questions yet. Unmesh, and then back to the briefing, please.
I'll be very brief, but this is important that I put my question about the extension of the furlough scheme formally to the panel. I've just seen today's papers that it looks like plans to have a normal Christmas could be altered quite drastically because of the expected rise in cases in November, December. 3,000 cases reported yesterday. And so, I mean, suppose maybe, Jules, you might want to come in, but the furlough scheme comes to an end at the end of October. Now, the effectiveness of the furlough scheme has been confirmed. Just look at various articles. Germany is extending its furlough scheme until the end of next year at a cost of £27 billion. And does anyone on the panel agree that there's a case for extending the furlough scheme in specific sectors like aviation that I talked about earlier, and the hospitality trade? It's not the jobs, but the impact of the local economy on high streets, around all the communities around Heathrow, around Gatwick, City Airport, my local airport, Stansted, and then in Luton. So I just want to actually get the panel's view on that.
I think that does take us back to the briefing and how effective government measures have been in supporting high streets. And I think one of the issues that has been of concern to a number of us has been whether or not it should be sector-specific in certain ways. So stopping the furlough scheme quite soon in certain sectors probably won't have too much of an impact, it would seem, because those sectors, there does seem to be people going back to work, but other sectors, which we keep touching on, do still seem to be struggling. So perhaps if we could go to Gianluca first of all. I don't know whether you're going to be joined by your accompanying small person voice there, but don't forget to unmute yourself. Do you think the government measures have been effective? Do you think they can be flexed going forward? Should they be flexed going forward?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think absolutely the answer is yes. I mean, you know, like I've been touching upon the points made earlier about the 8 out, 12 part campaign. It's definitely been a massive boost to, I guess, partly consumer confidence, but more importantly for some parts of the hospitality industry. And what we have seen, and I'm sure that all of you as well may be going out in your local high streets, you know, some businesses and some restaurants decided themselves to fund it and extend it. But again, it's a cost to them on top of, you know, a number of other costs that they have. And maybe this is actually possible for the month of September because they don't have to worry maybe about the salaries of the staff member. Yes, it has changed to the contribution of 10%, but still the furlough scheme maybe has been an element of them of reassurance. But definitely, I think, you know, particularly, I think, you know, Umesh has made this point, aviation, so anything to do with travel, so even hotels, of course, and hospitality have been hit the hardest. And I think, you know, there are maybe some specific sector flexible solutions, you know, in terms of the furlough that can be done at a maybe localized level and sector level.
Okay, thank you, Gianluca. That's really helpful. Kate, can I bring you in here at this point? Very welcome to join us, and thank you so much for coming back again. You've been very helpful. And obviously, actually, we've had Dominic and Jules as well, who've also been helpful before. You know, would you like to comment on the effectiveness of government measures and also whether some sort of specific sectoral support going forward is something that you would welcome?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and apologies that I wasn't able to join you for the earlier part of the session. I think we have had an unprecedented level of support from the Chancellor, particularly for hospitality, with all the schemes that have been mentioned and have been going on. Obviously, they are now starting to wind down, and the challenge that we've got in hospitality generally across the UK, and then more specifically within London, we still have large sections of the hospitality sector that are closed by legislation. So our nightclubs, many of our entertainment and music venues, but also large swathes of the hotel sector, and it's particularly relevant for London hotels. We don't yet have opening dates confirmed for events, functions and activities like conferences and exhibitions. Many millions of pounds will be generated for and already forward booked for Q4, which is the vital quarter for the events activity that takes place between Halloween and New Year's Eve, as you would expect. For many of our hotel businesses, central London businesses, a large proportion of their revenue and profits will be generated in the last quarter of the year. And so to be closed by legislation, to have no date for reopening of that, is putting intense pressure on them from investors, from banks, from landlords. And so we would be keen to talk to government about more targeted sector-specific support for those businesses that are closed by legislation, because clearly they've got no income coming in, they've got no certainty of income going forward, and they can't do any business planning. So unless we have some further support for those businesses, or we get them open, then it becomes incredibly challenging to avoid some of the significant job losses that Sean was talking about earlier in some of the sectors. And I think it is worth mentioning in this context, and apologies if you've already covered in this session, but our central London businesses are being disproportionately hit and are having a far slower level of recovery in hospitality than we are seeing across the rest of the UK. In particular, our central London hotels are down at below 20% occupancy and revenue levels, and have been since February this year as a direct result of COVID. Our pubs, bars and restaurants across the UK, 1 in 5 have still to open. In central London, it's 1 in 3, and those that are open are trading at significantly lower levels of revenues than the rest of the UK. So they are down at -40, -50% of revenues. Not sustainable in the medium to long term. So I think it's not necessarily a discussion about furlough per se. It's more about targeted support for those businesses and working out what support would be needed to bridge that gap. We've got a real challenge of getting between October and January next year, when the jobs retention bonus kicks in for many of these businesses, to try and make sure they've got the financial security to be able to survive, not just to keep employing people, but for the businesses to survive. We're actually focusing on now.
I think those are some very well made points, and I think it bears repeating that government support has been absolutely unprecedented and has really been helpful in keeping a lot of people going in terms of their lives as employees. But obviously we are moving into another phase of the response to the pandemic, and so there will be new challenges as the furlough scheme is scaled back. And I just wondered if perhaps I could bring in Dominic at this point to talk about the challenges that the high streets businesses are going to be facing as furlough and other support is withdrawn, and what measures are high streets able to take in preparation, and also now as it's starting to happen, as that government support is being scaled back. And you may want to comment on the sort of flexibility or the sector or geographical specific issues as well.
Thank you, Chair. I think there's probably 3 general things that would apply fairly uniformly. Firstly is the capacity of local authorities to respond. We've seen a significant, cut over about a decade in local authority funding capacity, more or less across the piece. So that's always going to be constrained. But I think there are local authorities who have been very forward-looking and very progressive in terms of how they sort of visualise their high streets and how they interact with all the different stakeholders there. And I think those local authorities that do have a kind of modern, positive view of what a high street or town centre should look like are probably in a better position than those who perhaps have been slightly reluctant to let go of perhaps a slightly more outdated image of what particular town centres look like. And I think that's probably less true that in London that there are those local authorities who have a more backward-looking view, in fairness. The other part is bids and the role that bids and other sort of town centre sort of business partnerships can play. Bid levies have still been payable, even though the business rates holiday has been in effect since April. And I think as shops and businesses and restaurants and other things have reopened and continue to do so, bids are going to play an ever more important role in generating that sort of sense of place and excitement and destination for the businesses and areas that they represent. So I think there's a really important role, and bids are probably more necessary and important than they have been for, frankly, for many years. And I think the third role is probably for the High Street Task Force, which sort of became fully operational just before the pandemic hit, so it was in a sense very well timed. This is a very welcome initiative by government to have a sort of central repository of information, of data collection and advice for local authorities and others to use to help promote local high streets and to find out what works, to share kind of best practice and good evidence to justify particular actions. And those are actions which needn't necessarily cost a lot of money, but which can actually be very effective in promoting local areas. And of course, throughout all of that, you've got the businesses themselves who operate in those areas, and they will have a mutual interest with the local authority, with bids, with others, in making sure that people are keen to visit and happy to do so. And hopefully, the government programme of investing in the High Street Fund will continue to happen, and maybe even be hopefully boosted a little bit by the need to invest in areas that are really suffering. And we've seen some government support both to bids and to local authorities to manage things like social distancing measures that they have to undertake. I think perhaps a more kind of joined up approach to that funding regime alongside the High Street fund, I think would be really welcome, so that we could then see a kind of more holistic package of measures that could support high streets. And I think probably subsidised or free parking in the run up to Christmas would be part of that package, a relatively inexpensive part of that package, but I think one which could be quite powerful when combined with things like awards to local authorities to manage or to improve the public realm and manage social distancing, and to do things that that really encourage people to come and visit.
Okay, well that's interesting, because that's a very different set of points really than the ones that Kate was focusing on. I'll just bring in Gianluca to see if there's anything that you would either like to add to the points that Kate and Dominic were making, or if there's anything else that you'd like to amplify. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think, Dom's point with regards to, I guess, our role of Business Improvement District is, of course, is key. What we've seen, of course, is that the more forward-looking local authorities have approached bids to deliver those very localized, like bottom-up kind of initiatives, like, for example, the safe reopening of the High Street Fund, for example, with Newham. They've approached us almost and commissioned us as a bid in Stratford to deliver that initiative, because we have those personal relationship with at the street level with the businesses. I have an ambassador that was doing the day-to-day liaison with businesses. So I guess it's kind of to reinforce that point that in some locations and where bids are effective and operating and have a good relationship with the local authority, I think we are best placed to kind of deliver that kind of short and medium term support for the high street in general.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to cut you short, but we've got some further questions about bids and high street, so we'll come back to you in a minute. And in fact, actually, I'm going to pass on to my colleague Caroline Russell, who's just here in the chamber as well, along with Assembly Member Murad Qureshi, and it's fantastic to be surrounded by people in the chamber. We're going to move on to talk about the impact of mayoral support and local interventions, and I'm quite sure at some point Caroline Russell is going to ask Dominic Curran, or at least mention something to do with his obsession with free parking, which he's mentioned at least 3 times now, because I suspect Caroline might have a slightly different view of it. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so this section of questions is looking at mayoral support and the impact of mayoral support and local interventions. And so I suppose these would really be things like the Pay It Forward scheme and the Resilient Fund, which I think has an innovation programme. And I just wonder, well, first of all, Jules, would you just be able to very briefly just outline for everyone what those mayoral direct intervention schemes have been doing?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a significant history of interventions that we've been making in high streets, and the programs are still just as relevant as today as they were then. I mean, when you look at the London plan, though, before I get into the programs, that was very much focused on creating a kind of a polycentric city.
Jules,
where
could I just pause you for a moment, because we're going to be coming on to something about the London Plan a little bit later. What I was wondering was if you were able to just give everyone a brief overview of Pay It Forward and the Resilience Fund and the Innovation Programme, those sort of direct COVID response economy schemes that exist, or or possibly Patrick could outline those.
I'm happy to do that if that's okay. So yeah, you mentioned Pay It Forward. So Pay It Forward was announced by the Mayor back in May or June, initially as a partnership with the crowdfunding platform Crowdfunder, to create the mechanism amplified by the Mayor to enable independent businesses, traders, small cultural organisations to effectively support their cash flow by selling services in advance and drawing in patronage whilst they weren't able to trade. That's subsequently been added to by a contribution of £1 million of LEAP funds working with the Mayor to support businesses who are raising funds on that platform, where they're seeking to adapt some sort of new innovation in their business approach. So there are £5,000 grants available to small businesses through that platform as well. For the cultural sector, the Mayor announced a 2.3 million cultural risk fund, again back in May, helping some of London's most at-risk creative and nighttime businesses, and the demand for that has been pretty unprecedented. So they're the two schemes. You talk about the Resilience Fund as well. The Resilience Fund has only quite recently been announced, and plans are being drawn up. There's been a call put out quite recently for innovative approaches to support some of the practices on the high street that have been brought into sharp relief during COVID. So not just retail uses, but thinking about how mutual aid organisations could be supported with resilience funding to support their operation and provide them with the capacity to go again, so to speak.
That's great. That's really helpful context. So now to Kate Nichols. Just thinking about those particular programmes, and also thinking about sort of our high streets and sort of the purpose of our high streets. How impactful do you think those programmes have been in supporting sort of a variety of high street businesses through the pandemic?
I think that in reality, if we're focusing it down on the high street and high street hospitality, they have been of limited benefit. The Culture at Risk Fund and the initiatives are particularly helpful for music venues, nighttime economy venues, but there's a large number of London nightclubs that haven't received support through that scheme yet, although we're trying to work with a number of them to help that. But I don't think that really impacts on the sort of suburban high street hospitality businesses that we're seeing across London. So I think that there is limited impact on the sort of pubs, bars, restaurants that are the core of London hospitality. And in particular, it hasn't really touched the sides for those businesses right in the central activity zone that are suffering the most from the impacts of COVID. Because in reality, for those central London businesses, what we're needing to do is to really drive footfall. We've lost all our international tourists, almost all our international tourists, and we've lost all of our business travellers. And for central London hospitality businesses, that's about 60 to 70% of their normal revenues come from that type of activity. And so those initiatives are great at saving some of the grassroots venues and the sort of those businesses that are at risk. They're not really necessarily designed to help those businesses that would normally be sustainable in normal times, would normally not need any help and support from the Mayor or from national government, would normally be the economic generators. They are the ones that are struggling. And actually what we really need from the Mayor's team is activity that will generate footfall, both outer Londoners being encouraged to come back into London, domestic tourist visits coming back into London, while we are going to have a protracted and long-standing drop in international tourism numbers for what is going to be well over a year. And so, I mean, that's sort of more a sort of tourist answer, but our high street hospitality businesses in and around London are really needing footfall drivers and direct push to get people back into those businesses.
When this committee did a report on the nighttime economy, Rewrite the Night, back in 2017, and we did quite a lot of looking at how culture can be used to help to generate footfall. Now, obviously, the cultural industries, the theatres are really struggling because of the physical distancing requirements. But do you think that there is more scope for using cultural activity to help to recover from the COVID crisis, to help to generate footfall, both in the centre and also in the outer boroughs? We heard about things going on in Croydon and Waltham Forest to use culture to boost their nighttime economies. But do you think more could be done with culture in this case?
Yes, I think undoubtedly that's the case, and I think we do need to be quite creative about it, obviously, while we've got social distancing restrictions in place. But culture is going to be a key part of our recovery, as is tourism, if we're looking at London as a whole. And I think, you know, that report that you alluded to, but also the Nighttime Commission report that I chaired, it highlighted the fact that this is a very fragile, interrelated, holistic framework. You know, these businesses rely upon each other, and if one bit goes down and one bit struggles, then it's a house of cards, and everything will impact upon it. I think there's much more that we could have done over the summer to use public spaces, the public realm, more creatively to generate that footfall, to bring people in, to encourage people to look at what you're doing. Actually, the boroughs have been really fantastic at seizing that opportunity and doing some really creative things, as have the bids. That actually acts as a polarisation, because we've all stayed in our outer London boroughs. And we haven't had the incentive to come in. There's been a very limited campaign to get Londoners to come into London and to use that. And I think we could have used our outdoor spaces over the course of the summer to generate some much needed footfall, which would have supported those hospitality businesses, which would have encouraged people to come in and explore their city while it was really quiet. And you didn't have a large number of footfall, and culture would have been an important part of that. There's a lot of creative ideas that could have been used to exploit that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, presumably even in the winter, if we're talking about outdoor events, actually getting Londoners walking and cycling into central London through, I mean, I cycled through the city today and it's transformed. It's, you know, they've been incredibly brave at reducing the traffic and making sure that it's a decent place to be, and that would, you know, could get, yes, sort of day out people. So do you think that, I mean, should we be asking the mayor to try and put on some sort of big cultural events to get people out in the winter? I think what we should be doing is
asking London and partners to focus on some of that activity, because it's quite clear that there will be quite a considerable disruption to international business and international tourism and travel. So we should very definitely be focusing on domestic and day trips. And I think having a plan of action in the run-up to Christmas, bearing in mind that we still have this great uncertainty as to whether we will be able to put on a number of Christmas events that are critical to the London economy in our indoor event spaces, I think that would be a great idea to be able to generate it. It needs coordination. There's an awful lot of creativity that's out there in the business themselves that will work to generate ideas, to bring forward ideas. It does need coordination. And crucially, you mentioned how easy and fantastic it is to move around once you get into the centre of London. We do have to accept that people have to travel on public transport to get into the centre of London. So they actually do need to be encouraged to travel on the tubes, to travel on the buses, on the trains, to make people feel that it is safe, to have that explicit message that it is okay to travel on public transport, to come in and enjoy the centre of London, because that's the challenge that we've got at the moment. People are shopping, eating, experiencing culture locally, which is brilliant for the vibrancy and dynamism of our boroughs, but it does mean we've got this real donut effect with central London businesses really struggling, and we do need to do something exceptional to encourage people back into the centre, and that does mean not just cycling and walking, but also transport in.
Yeah, well, the buses are moving much more efficiently now with the 24/7 bus lanes, and the through the city, travelling by bus is incredibly efficient because there's so little traffic. So it's certainly, yeah, anyone who's thinking about travelling into London on a bus, I totally recommend it. Can I just get on to thinking about local communities? There was a mention of mutual aid and the way that sort of mutual aid has, I can't remember, who was that, Patrick mentioning mutual aid groups was that being supported to use high street venues for food banks and things like that? Is that what you were talking, I mean, is that another use of the high streets?
Yeah, I mean, mutual aid organisations live on the high street in the same way that retail and other uses do, and they've become incredibly important, more important than ever during COVID.
So, just if I can go to Gianluca and also to Dominic, and just to find out if you've got any thoughts about the importance of how local communities have sort of rallied round their high streets. I mean, Kate was just talking about, you know, how everyone's staying very local and going out locally, and certainly I've seen around where I'm living, there's a lot of support for the local businesses there. But yes, sort of, do you have examples of, you know, local communities that are doing good things that could be replicated elsewhere? Maybe starting with Gianluca.
I think I guess, you know, my experience, I guess, is both from maybe residents' point of view and also from a business point of view in terms of local communities. Well, what I've seen in my own street is that all of a sudden, you know, you're starting to become actually friend with all of your neighbors, and you have these WhatsApp groups at this very basic level. But I'm thinking about mutual aid, I guess, you know, is also that very basic level of actually during the lockdown, if anybody needed some help or even to buy groceries. So from that, from the residential point of view, I guess, you know, there's been that kind of, you know, literally next door neighbor support on WhatsApp group. They actually were pointing out to, oh, you know, the local baker is open versus the local butcher or fishmonger, for example. So from that point of view, I guess, you know, we you know, from my own personal experience, you know, that's what I've seen. But from a, you know, business community point of view, you know, again, you know, I guess what the role of BIDS has been is about bringing all of them together. At the first stage was very reactionary in terms of, you know, them sharing their own personal experiences and fears. But then, you know, like when we moved on to from a kind of, you know, crisis stage into like a recovery stage, it's been more about mutual aid in terms of sharing ideas and talking to each other about how they have responded and adapted to social distancing and the whole pandemic. So I think, you know, like from that point of view, you know, the role of these very localized networks has been incredible. But I guess is what do we do next? And, you know, for us as BIDS is around kind of, you know, evolving, and, you know, some BIDS have done that already, and some are maybe in the process of doing that. But actually to think about business, you know, like it's a concept that is kind of, you know, going around, you know, with high streets and in the whole high streets conversation about like community improvement districts. And what I'm trying to do in both areas is actually to evolve from a business community, business district into like a wider community that where we are interacting with a number of communities. And just to touch on this, and I'm sure that we're going to cover that later, but, you know, in Brixton, for example, we are calling for the pedestrianisation of a number of streets in central Brixton. And of course to have access for business deliveries and emergency vehicles and all of that. But the point is that once we put out a vision document, quite a lot of local groups have actually gotten in touch with us willing to provide their support, their input into that. So I think, you know, like this is a time of transformation potentially for London and for the business and residential community to work even more closely together.
Thank you. That's very inspiring. And Dominic, just in terms of sort of retail and high street, sort of thinking about the central London situation, is there any community support for those high streets, or are they entirely dependent on not people who live nearby, but tourism and business commuter footfall?
I mean, I'm not an expert on the nature of the customer base of shops in central London, but I think it's fairly self-evident that, from the evidence we've heard today, the very centre of London is seeing the biggest drop in footfall, and the reasons relating to things we mentioned earlier, like the virtual, the ceasing of tourist and business travel internationally, a huge reduction in even domestic tourism, I would suspect, in central London, people working from home and limits on capacity. Have all contributed to, to a much bigger drop in footfall and turnover in the very centre. So, the extent to which there is a residential community is probably limited. The number of people living in central London, although it's gone up in recent years, is probably relatively small. Mm-hmm. And I suspect many of those people may well have homes in other places that they may have decamped to for this period. So, I'm not optimistic for the businesses in the very centre in terms of a strong community. That said, I suspect the people who live in central London have probably got a little bit more disposable income than others, so maybe they could be spending it locally, but that's not really for me to say.
Yep. And then finally on this section of questions for Gianluca, if there's anything extra that you want to say about the bids in Brixton and Stratford High Street, about what those bids are doing to support that revitalisation of those areas, if there's anything you haven't yet had a chance to say.
Again, it's kind of, we're looking at this from a different stage point of view. So originally it was around primarily communication, so sharing with our business community everything that, I guess, central government and more at a local level was available for them in terms of the support and offer and access to grants, for example, or the other activities that the mayor has put in place as well. So we continue to do that, but we now moved on to the kind of recovery stage, and we are delivering much more practical initiatives I kind of touched upon earlier around, for example, we've been commissioned by Newham for the delivery of a fairly basic, it might sound, but actually very important initiative of actually installing. We've installed over 200 vinyls in the Stratford High Street to support social distancing and queue management, because again, we've seen, in terms of from an experience point of view for the consumer, it's very confusing sometimes where you don't know where you're standing in the queue, which queue belongs to which shop. So we kind of went at a very strict level to kind of think about the consumer experience once you get into the high street, and again work with Newham, with Newham in terms of the funding for the delivery of it. But then in Brixton, again, I kind of touched upon it a bit earlier, we want to go a little bit further, and, we are kind of, we want to see a number of streets that are semi-pedestrianised, and I know that, low traffic neighbours have been in place, and partly also in one of the roads in Brixton. So in Atlantic Road in Brixton, there is going to be a semi-pedestrianisation, so we're working very closely with the businesses, the local authority, to see whether there is something that, well, it's going to happen, but to see how businesses can almost take advantage of it. We talked about, some businesses operating at a 50% capacity indoor, so why not, of course, spilling into the pavements and into the streets to allow people to have tables and chairs. And yes, there has been I was very frustrated, during the summer months where we couldn't do quickly enough, we couldn't respond quickly enough with tables and chairs, this al fresco kind of, dining approach, and we will moving into the winter months, but still I think if there is that infrastructure that is available in public spaces for businesses, I think people will come out and spend money locally, both in central London and in outer London. So I think there's more that can be done for the next months, and I guess bids are best placed to coordinate a relationship between the local authority and businesses.
Thank you. That's a very good point about that coordination role for bids. So this moves us on to the final chunk of questions, which I'm starting, and which is looking at the opportunities to support high streets sort of as we move through the pandemic and hopefully come out towards another side of things. So starting off with planning for the future of the high street, coming back to Jules and Patrick, is the change to the high street that we've been hearing about this morning and brought about by COVID-19 temporary, or should we be planning for a new type of high street?
Well, I think we should have been planning for, and we were in the GLA with the mayor, planning for a new type of high street anyway. I mean, as I started off earlier this morning saying that, changes have always been ongoing, and the latest wave of changes pre-COVID in the changing nature of shopping was an existential threat to many high streets and town centres, and they were having to adapt as they always have done. And we had a series of interventions, adaptive strategies for high streets, and we can take you through that work. In terms of planning, as I was about to say earlier, that I have been asked several times in recent months, many times in recent months, over, does COVID mean that changes are needed in the London plan? And I don't think they are at all. I think the kind of things we were seeking in the plan, in the changes to the public realm, better public realm, more public realm, better and more play space, more walking and cycling, more pedestrianisation, giving more opportunities for restaurants to spill out onto the streets, for a more kind of outdoor pavement experience. It's interesting when you look at Copenhagen that with their kind of slightly cooler climate than us, they really didn't have much of an outdoor cafe culture until about sort of 15, 20 years ago. They began to improve their public realm and invest in their public realm and become less car dominated and more cycling and walking, and actually improving public space in that way has kind of overcome, if you like, the climate, and it's now far more an outdoor cafe culture. So actually the intention in the plan to go in that, take London in that direction, in that more healthier direction, fits perfectly with any kind of scenario in the future which suggests that from time to time we will have to be more separate and therefore more outdoor. And unfortunately, sort of some of the thinking that I've been reading from scientists suggests that, that even if there is a vaccine, it's not a once and for all vaccine, that it will be for that kind of, that particular strain, and we could see future waves for many years. Hopefully it won't be anything as drastic as we've experienced now, and it will be of a level that will, with more mild adaptations, we'll be able to cope with that. But I think that probably directs us to a more to a less dense approach in the way that we have our public interactions.
Certainly the idea of Copenhagen, I mean, if they can have an outdoor eating culture and outdoor, kind of, that makes sense that we can do it in London even in the winter, and probably should be. What do you think, Jules, are the key structural and infrastructural changes that are going to be needed to revitalise London's high streets? And that's both the kind of the outer or the ones, I think you referred to them earlier as more local rather than the kind of central London ones, but also central London.
Well, we'd be really keen to support local authorities, to enable them to sort of intervene, develop new planning tools. Certainly in the changes that are being promoted by the government in planning, those of them that do survive the commons and become introduced, we would want to help boroughs negotiate those. Acquiring and managing assets, I think that will, especially with the kind of use class E being introduced, I think that there'll be more of a desire for boroughs to actually intervene and own assets to prevent unwelcome changes. Certainly at my own borough we did that to prevent permitted development rights when we didn't want to lose office space in Shoreditch. And so I think perhaps local authorities may be more disposed to doing that. More experimentation and seeding new uses. I come back to my sort of curation and shaping. I think that's going to be very, very necessary in the future.
Thank you. So moving on to look at London's street space plan. This is the sort of government directed plan to avoid having gridlock when all the people who normally use the tube and the buses and weren't because of physical distancing, to avoid all of them getting in their cars. There's been money that's been being spent all over London on pop-up bike lanes, space for physical distancing where pavements have been widened, and also low traffic neighbourhoods. And I think, Gianluca, you've touched on trying to get some street changes in Brixton, and I just wonder if you've had experience of the London Street Space scheme in the Brixton area and what impact that's had on business.
Yeah, so Brixton Road has been affected by that, which is a TfL controlled road in terms of the widening on the pavement, and more specifically Atlantic Road is part of the Railton Road low traffic neighbourhood. I think what's been interesting for me in conversations with officers, but also with elected members within Lambeth and local councillors, is actually quite a lot of, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, across London, quite a lot of resistance from a number of residents, very, very vocal resistance, but also very vocal communities in support of it. So I think, for me is, in a place like Brixton, is thinking quite a lot about, these kind of two separate ways of thinking and interpreting, local areas and the neighborhoods. Within the businesses, of course, we haven't, the only kind of, impact so far that we've seen has been more around the deliveries, I guess. And that's why for me, these I guess, case study that we are developing with Atlantic Road is only like a stretch of Atlantic Road would be very interesting for us. And we're literally starting the engagement over the next few weeks to discuss with businesses how they can, and the positioning of the scheme for me is got to be positive, so how they can take advantage of these changes, because these are happening, they're inevitable, and how they can adapt to that in terms of, as I said, deliveries, in terms of maybe creating outdoor seating, public, but also, privately managed with tables and chairs. So I think, this is on a small scale, but I guess, it's going to kind of give us a little bit more of a understanding about how that can be replicated. And again, with businesses, are run by people, and people sometimes are resistant to change. So I'm sure that there is going to be the ones that are going to be thinking about, less people can drive into the area, less money. But actually, maybe after, maybe we saw as an example, after you create an environment that people feel safe and, it is actually functional for business, actually people come and spend money in the area. So I think, it's a bit too soon, I guess, for me to kind of, share some more kind of, more real opinions and views. We are just on the cusp on implementing something like that. But, from our perspective, we want this to happen, and we would like other streets to be pedestrianised or semi-pedestrianised in Brixton. So it's something that we will definitely commit to deliver with our businesses.
Thank you. And Dominic, do you have any thoughts on any of the street space measures that have been put in the centre of London? I know they've done things in Soho to make space available for dining. There's a lot of work happened in the city. I think they were very concerned about having huge queues of people waiting to get into buildings because of the lift capacity preventing people getting into buildings efficiently. So I think they were trying to make extra pedestrian space in the city to allow for queues of people, though actually people have not turned up to the buildings because it's pretty inefficient to queue for hours to get into a building through a rather restricted lift system. So they've tended to stay at home and keep sending their emails from there. But yes, have you got any thoughts on the street space measures?
Yeah, I think when it's been undertaken in areas of sort of high footfall and high streets, and particularly in the centre of London, I think there's a lot of merit in it. And it does work at the moment because, as somebody else said earlier, there is actually I think it was you actually, there's very little traffic in London in general compared to pre-COVID levels. So actually, you are able to remove some of the street space and devote it to pedestrians. It hasn't all been necessary, I would agree. Certainly where I live in the borough of Hackney, parts of the A10 have been effectively taken over by sort of blue bollard, TfL's blue bollards, and they're really not necessary. There aren't that many people out on the streets requiring sort of that amount of extra street space, however nice it might be to actually walk along. Where I think it's maybe not been as well considered has been in sort of closing off a lot of roads to make them pedestrian and cycle only. Certainly, again, in Hackney where I live, which generally has a fairly unblemished record, I think, in local transport, they, over the summer, closed off huge swathes of the area around where I live without really any consultation or notice, and they've actually created more traffic because we've got hundreds of cars now driving all the way around a system apparently designed by a lunatic, a vindictive lunatic, one might argue, looking for a way through this Byzantine maze of bollards and planters, which look very nice, but are actually just a nightmare to live around if you're actually trying to get from A to B.
I suspect that what they're trying to do is to discourage you from actually using a car for a local car journey. What they're trying to do is to make sure that there are fewer people who normally use the bus or the tube deciding to use a car rather than deciding to walk or cycle.
Can we try and stick to? I mean, I think you're straying into the low traffic neighbourhoods in side streets where a lot of planters have been installed in various parts of London. However, that's mainly not in high streets.
Indeed.
I'm sorry to reel you back to the high street again. And the street space is mainly on the more major roads, which have also suffered quite a lot of changes as well in certain areas. And I say suffered rather than benefited from, because I think the jury is still out. A lot of people are saying positive things about them, some people are saying negative. But if we can steer away from the low traffic neighbourhoods, which are not part of street space and are essentially local authority designed, so that's a Hackney thing rather than a mayoral thing, because otherwise we'll end up talking about them.
We could talk about it for hours.
I think it will be a different meeting, and this is the Economy Committee and not the Transport Committee, if I can just put that out there.
So we have one final question that I have, which is for Jules in particular, which is sort of what do you think the impact has been of the emergency social distancing measures for high streets, and do you think any of these measures should be made permanent?
So when you say the measures, as in the responses to facilitate more street space?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, I think that
Jules, you've muted yourself.
Lost you.
Jules, you're mute.
Sorry, don't know how that happened.
That's better.
Well, as you yourself said, Caroline, I mean, they're largely very, very positive. But from Dominic is also right that they need to be done with consultation and not in a knee-jerk reaction. And some of them, as I say, I don't want to get off the high street and be pulled up by the chair. But on those side street issues, you need to take residents. You need to take residents with you. I think the overall though, the sort of making more space for people, for pedestrians, and for communal life is absolutely at the heart of what good growth agenda, good growth by design, the London plan. Is all about. It's about making more space for human society, civil interaction. and as well as obviously reduce, and part and parcel of that is the reduction in pollution and congestion that goes with that. So those kind of those particular measures are surely welcome and should stay. I'd like to see us getting to a point where we can remove the stickers from the ground, though, enforcing 2-metre distancing. I'm sure we'd all welcome that.
Thank you. That's a great place to pause. Chair, back to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Caroline, for undertaking that long list of questions. Now, we're going to move on to another section on 15-minute cities and what that's all about. And we're going to be taking some questions now from Assembly Member Sean Bailey. So, Sean, over to you. And if you've muted yourself, don't forget to unmute.
Thank you, Chair. I've unmuted. I'm going to start with Jules. Jules, this first question seems slightly anomalous in that it's asking, what has COVID-19 changed? How has COVID-19 changed Londoners' attitudes to walking and cycling, and do high streets need to reflect this? So what should be the high street's response to this possibly new way of viewing cycling and walking?
Well, apologies to you and to the committee. I might be in danger of, I will be in danger of repeating myself. I mean, I take it as read what I just said to Caroline, that, these are, more walking and cycling, opening up more space for civic interaction and for high street, commerce and, particularly the sort of the outdoor eating and congregation, whether it doesn't have to be, sort of paid for eating at restaurants spilling out on the streets, whether it's more table tennis tables, more open-air balls courts, whatever you like. It's, I think, making space for that has got to be a positive thing. It was something that, as you can see in the London plan or all the good growth initiatives that we've been looking at or supporting with the £35 million good growth fund. That was, all pre-COVID, and I think what we are the kind of society that I think more people would, and behaviours that people would like to see post-COVID, are very much what was in the plan. I mean, yes, Paris did have this 15-minute cities title. Which is catchy, but of course it's for a much smaller area than Greater London. Our ambition as a polycentric, with our polycentric approach, is that all places across London should benefit from having a vibrant, civic-oriented high street nearby. 90% of London is within 10 minutes of a high street. Sadly, not all of them vibrant historically. But we would want to see that change. In Paris, it's very much the centre, the central Ile de Paris area that the 15-minute city actually applies to, not the whole of Greater Paris. So there are definitely two levels of ambition there. But the high streets for all is one of the 8 missions that I referred to earlier in the recovery plan. And that's something we're going to be working on closely with all the boroughs. We want to see sort of, new, improved, vibrant high streets right across every London borough.
I think that's correct. I think there's one comment and one plea I would make. I think we need to elevate walking. I think cycling has a greater noise behind it. And as a cyclist, please give me somewhere to park the bike. If there's one thing that prevents me cycling somewhere, it's having somewhere to lock the bike, because I'd like to retain ownership of it. It was very expensive. Just to go a bit deeper into this 15-minute city thing, the comparison with Paris, I think you've pointed out, isn't exactly apples and apples, as it were. We have a far bigger commuter base, for instance. But how can we solve this tension between the need to get people back into the centre of London, because the centre of London will die without those people in it, and also this idea that we want people to stay outside? I'll give you an example. People are talking about the reduction in carbon from the reduction in travel, but there's a tension there, because what about the need to heat my home? If I stay at home, I heat my individual home. If I come into City Hall, I share the heating with 300 to 400 other people. So what kind of planning, what kind of tension are you trying to mitigate with the policies coming down from the Mayor?
I wouldn't for a second say that this is an alternative, or should be an alternative to coming into the city. I think, you've listed a couple. I think everyone can list many, together we can list many reasons why we would want to see a restored city centre to London. And that's not just about the economy and getting people to go into prep. And it's not actually just about the big issue of the great, GVA money spinner that is culture in London. Creates a huge amount of revenue for the rest of the country, as well as being socially and culturally important to our well-being. I personally think that there is there's a real mental health issue about being locked at home, staring at screens in this way. I cannot fathom how we will have the next generation of sort of white-collar apprenticeships delivered if we're not in offices. The informal learning that we've all benefited from being amongst colleagues, the water cooler moments, and not discussing the previous night's telly, but just a general chat about work. I think there are myriad ways in which society around the world, and in London in particular, being the world's greatest global city, will be losing out if we don't restore that a fair degree of the way we worked. Perhaps with fewer of the disbenefits, though. When we're with the commuting, can we get a bit clever about the way we use the commute? I know staggered starts. We were talking about that before COVID. So, what kind of investments we should be talking about, the kind of investments we should be making in the way that we plan for it to be better, not necessarily just different or not to do it. As I say, people talking a lot about, is there much office space needed? I think we're probably going to need more office space if we really ought to be spreading out and doing things differently. Perhaps not just rows and rows of desks, though. Perhaps more collaborative office space. But I don't know. There's a lot of thought that needs to go into this, and I don't think knee-jerk reactions are a good thing. And as I say, I think the office is dead, and we're all home workers now, I think is very wide of the mark.
I fully concur with what you're saying, but that's why it's been slightly disappointing. On the other end, in the beginning of our conversation, we seem to be talking about that the centre of London is dead, people won't be returning to it. Of course, the mayor has made those comments in the newspaper and is sending the wrong message, when in the medium to long term, we need a definite return to the centre of London. And the conversation should be about innovation. So in that guise, I ask you, are there any particular barriers to London becoming a 15-minute city, but also retaining some of our historical travel into the centre that we need to keep our really rather large economy going?
No, I don't think there are any fundamental barriers to doing both. Because, as I say, we in the plan with that was the idea that we would have both. The plan recognises the importance of the CAS to certainly to the economy and to the importance of London and indeed the world. So it recognises the importance of CAS and supports the continuation and the flourishing of the CAS, yet at the same time had many policies about creating what is for shorthand called the 15-minute city. Although, as I say, I think ours is probably more sort of a high streets for all, because as I say, the 15-minute city, again, not only is it a size thing in Paris, it's a density thing. It covers an area that's probably about 7 times as dense as the Greater London area in Paris. So when you have that kind of economic density, it's far easier to say, well, every 15 minutes, you're going to be there for a full suite of all the services that you could hope for, from cinemas to restaurants to shops to business district. It's not feasible to have that in sort of absolutely everywhere in London within 15 minutes, because the density wouldn't be there to economically support it. So we need to kind of adopt a slightly different approach. It's effectively the same, the same aspiration to have things locally for those people who need it, but that shouldn't subtract from the need to have a vibrant city centre. as I say though, that it's easier to describe that as the destination. It's what's problematic is where we are now. As I say, where we are now, at the risk of repeating myself, that we have offices where 2/3 of the people, or more than 2/3 of the people, are being told not to come in, and that audience, that ready-made audience, from everything from prep to all those closed pubs and to currently closed culture, is not available in the evenings to go to those, and so obviously undermining the possibility of that reopening. And we've seen the rise in the last few days and the terrible predictions that are being made for the for the coming weeks and months, particularly the chronic as opposed to acute situation that could be occurring over December, January. And I think we have to be really responsible as to what we're telling people to do, but also we have to be realistic about what's going to happen. So I think it's a case of both planning and designing for the way we want to see it, and that's all the positive things that I think we've been discussing this morning. But we also have to, secure from government, because they're the only ones with the money, about how to negotiate the transition. And so for example, as I said earlier, because if there is a change, even a small change in attitudes about working from home, and therefore there's a little, in the long term, there's slightly fewer people in the evenings to go to restaurants and culture, then if that's enough to threaten the base of that, the economic base of that, then we need to plan for that now and decide how we adapt to that. But in the interim, that's a different question. In the interim, it's about government support and targeted furlough schemes, because even if I was to sort of take your proposition that, well, it's a matter of campaigning to get people back, I would have thought even if we doubled the number of people coming into London, whether that's wise or not, even if we doubled them, I think by any measure one could say that would be a runaway success as a campaign. But if it was only filling the current businesses that were open to 80% of their capacity, and they're not breaking even, it still doesn't work. So I think this is a fundamental issue about what levels of activity and margins business have got to operate to actually be viable into the long term. And we're working on trying to understand that. We're posing that question, and we need to understand what that level of viability is, because even this small change in usage could be an existential threat.
You're certainly right, but of course, whatever we calculate, the more people we get involved coming in who can, the smaller the need will be. Much of the answer to this isn't just money from the government, because like local authorities, like the GLA, the government is seeing a reduction in its income as well. And we're now talking about how much debt do we carry forward as a nation. So as much as that we can mitigate as early on is better. And ultimately, the businesses, particularly in the central London, which support other businesses and are part of the ecosystem, so anything from window cleaners to self-employed barristers, whatever it is, need people, not the government. So there's a balancing act here, and what I'm suggesting is we are, the GLA, the mayor, is far too heavily asking the government for everything, when ultimately it is our economy above the government that provide these things, so we need to do our bit to get that going. But just to move on, to ask Gianluca, and what role do you think bids can play in generating a 15-minute city? We sort of moved beyond the concept of a 15-minute city, and I think that's correct. London is a very different place to Paris. But what role can bids play in promoting their local area, but also reminding people your local area, a local area, is part of a bigger London economy?
Sean, this group of questions is meant to be with Murad.
And, sorry, I thought I was meant to go to... 10.
Don't worry, it's been asked.
Chair.
I'll follow in behind.
Okay, so Murad says he'll do some follow-ups to you.
Thank you, Murad. Thank you.
Can I answer now then, yeah? Yeah, thank you, Sean. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I think Jules put it quite well. It's not, and I guess, the whole, I guess, philosophy of the 15-minute city is more about how easy it is to get to your local kind of high street. And, the whole point is to kind of, using this COVID as an opportunity to, I guess, build the infrastructure so that, local residents can get to their local high street and shops, quite easily by walking and cycling ideally. So I think it's more of an approach rather than necessarily a definition that we, like the 15-minute city. But yeah, our role, I guess, is around kind of not, kind of touched upon it earlier to a certain extent, but our point of bids, some bids, as I said, do it better than others. It's not just being inward looking, just as a membership organization delivering services to our members, but more around the role that we play in the wider community and actually looking at changing the way also we communicate. So maybe the website being also consumer facing. And again, I touched upon it earlier about more community improvement district, where we actually curate the whole of the neighborhood in Stratford and Brixton and be the point of contact for everybody, whether you're a business or a resident, kind of, being consumer facing or residents facing. And then I guess, I think, the implication for businesses on that is more around logistics, the actual basics of running a business, which are, receiving deliveries at a certain time on a certain day with certain vehicles. So I think, in terms of, trying to deliver this type of plays, we need to think about actually the logistics and operationals of for businesses. And, we are looking, and I know that, many London boroughs are doing that. We're looking at alternative, maybe green last mile solutions for businesses. So talking about also micro consolidation points within town centers or, like a group of town centers, so that it's very much a localized delivery service that can be used. So I think, there is a number of implications for businesses around the move towards this type of city. But definitely, I think, like COVID is speeding up the change. So something that maybe we wanted to deliver within 10 years, now we want to and maybe could deliver it in 10 months. I mean, maybe I'm being ambitious, but the point is like shortening the speed of change.
Thank you. And lastly, with Kate and Dominic, where do businesses see themselves in the recovery and in this concept of either very active local areas or the 15-minute city, whichever more appeals to you? Where do business see themselves? This is a live concept for business, or are you just focused on your bottom line and surviving COVID?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, it's very much the latter for a lot of retail businesses. Instead of doing sort of quarterly or monthly cash flow planning, a lot of our members are doing weekly cash flow planning. So, frankly, it's a little bit of a luxury to think about the nature of spatial development in London or anywhere else at the moment. What I think is important is that people will have the ability to actually visit their local businesses or access local areas, and that we won't go back to the debate around public transport and certainly not free parking. But that's really the important thing is being able to get enough footfall, get enough sales to pay your staff and stay functioning as an entity. And anything else is a luxury at the moment for a lot of our members.
Okay, thank you.
I think we would be even more in that space than Dominic's members are, because hospitality was slower to reopen. So the retail outlets reopened first, and obviously hospitality was later. It is very much survival. We are still in the middle of the COVID crisis, although lots of other people have moved on and the policy discussions have moved on. We're still living and breathing it, and it's daily for some of our members, not weekly. Particularly the challenge where they are not yet open, and we've got large swathes of London hospitality that isn't open yet. So it is quite difficult. I think just moving it on, we will obviously eventually be able, hopefully, to lift our eyes above and look strategically. There is a challenge there because the resilience, the ability to invest in bids, the ability to invest in high street regeneration. Over the last decade, that's been driven by hospitality largely. Retail has been in structural change. Hospitality has picked up some of the slack there. And you've had a business that's been growing in the high street at about 4 or 5% year on year and generating 1 in 6 of net new jobs. I think the challenge going forward as we move into the recovery phase, which for us will be next year, probably after next April, depending on what happens with business rates. The challenge will be, where's that cash, where's that resilience, where's that ability to regenerate and invest in our high streets going to come from? Because the resilience of the hospitality sector will be stretched for quite a considerable time to come. In terms of the 15-minute city, and the point about Paris is well made, I think what we do need to do is to make sure that we are curating spaces so that we have mixed use developments. What we've seen quite a lot in our outer London boroughs is a loss of local office space and mixed working spaces as a move to residential. And I think also there is a planning issue that needs to be grappled with there, depending on whether the COVID predictions result in longer term change. We have retail and hospitality businesses in those local outer boroughs that are based on commuters returning to home as well. If you are going to have more people living there in the day, that will change the nature of the retail shops that they have and the nature of the hospitality services that we need. So our businesses are well able to pivot and adapt. We are very innovative, but that is a longer term challenge depending on how long this goes. And just one final point, if I may, just to pick up on some of the points that were made earlier about transport and network and planning and consultation. There's a lot of stuff that has been made in the public health realm and a lot of decisions made, but also in the public space, the planning space, the transport space, the office space. We've had some very rapid decisions that we've had to take about what we think we might need to do in order to respond to the COVID crisis. I think as policymakers, I would encourage people to now take a pause because some of those predictions that we were thinking our way through in March to June haven't materialised. And therefore, we just need to make sure that we touch base back with the businesses, back with the local residents, and make sure that the plans we had in place, whether that's the blue bollards, the sort of local areas, the eating out, just making sure that we touch back with our local stakeholders to consult to see whether it's working effectively. Because for every resident that might find that there's an easier way through, there is going to be Dominic who's going to be stuck with changes in rat runs, but equally some of those roads are vital for deliveries to get through to local neighbourhoods. Neighbourhoods are not and high streets are not just our major town centres. You know, I live in Ealing. My neighbourhood shopping area is not Ealing Broadway, it is the little street down the road that needs to get the deliveries coming through that is inhibited by some of the measures. So I think I would just encourage people not to think that we're in a long-term change, but to continue to consult, pause, do it rapidly on a sort of monthly basis almost, to have that real touchstone so that we do build back better.
Kate, Dominic, Jules, thank you very much. Chair, over to you. And Murad, thank you.
Right, thank you. Mira, do you feel that your questions on the role that bids can play have been sufficiently covered there?
They have done. I just wanted one thing to go back to, if you don't mind, Chair, before you ask people to make their finishing comments. I was just still thinking when we were discussing social distancing, whether at the moment it's 2 metres distance. I mean, would reducing that to a metre make a huge difference for our high streets in increasing business turnover and footfall? Is that where we need to go in the present circumstances, or is that still a no-no and we've got to wait till the central government to lead on that? Any thoughts?
I'm not sure that necessarily any of our guests will know the final
Yeah,
answer
exactly,
to
I
that,
know. It was just my thought.
But it is certainly true that there's a number of other countries who've got a 1 metre social distance rather than a 2 metre social distance. Of course, the problem is if it's 2 metres, people move down to 1.5 or 1, and if it's 1 metre, certainly my experience is that they get a lot closer than that. But you know,
okay,
and
I
then
just put that thought out.
and if you look at the countries who are doing that, for example, France, their coronavirus statistics are now raised. So I think I'm going to answer that comment.
Thank you, Chair.
So we have one final question which I'd like to pose to Gianluca, Kate and Dominic, and if anyone else wants to come in as well. and that's what role must the Mayor and Government play in supporting the recovery and renewal of London's high streets? And if I can ask you to focus on very specifically, what would be your top thing for the Mayor and what would be your top thing for government? And I'm going to start with Kate first.
Gosh, I was hoping you'd start with somebody else and then I could have a breathing space to think about that in more detail. But my top thing for the Mayor is active promotion, encouragement of participation in our town centres and our high streets, and particularly around the central activity zone. I think one of the things we saw in hospitality with the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, the reason that was a success was it got people over that psychological hurdle of coming back in and built that confidence. But more importantly, they had an explicit permission to do what they considered to be part of their normal lives. And I do think we need, having had very strong messages from central government and from the Mayor about what not to do, we now need to be having explicit encouragement of what to do. And I do think we need that, London is open kind of message coming back through to the fore and a direct encouragement. And then in terms of the government, I think it's, from a high street specific perspective, they really do need to be focusing attention now on business rates. They need to be looking at making sure we've got a fit for purpose regime going forward that supports high street development. What we've seen recently is that our high streets have suffered because we have a regime that was set in the 1980s, when you went around with a Walkman and probably roller skates, and nobody had a mobile phone, and there was probably one computer per high street, let alone per household. We need to have a regime that meets the needs of the 21st century, and we need to look at business taxation in the round to make sure that we're incentivising our high streets to be able to deliver that. Okay, thank you. And I'm now going to pick on Dominic. Dominic, what would be your the key thing that you think that the Mayor must do and your top of your list for the government?
Very unoriginally, I'm going to echo completely what Kate says. I remember living in London just after 9/11, and the then Mayor, Ken Livingstone, had a very strong promotional campaign to get people out visiting the city after a lot of sort of worry about sort of future terror attacks. And I think that was very successful. I think something as all-encompassing and as energetic and enthusiastic as that is necessary. Recognising that there will be limitations in terms of being able to offer some £10 theatre tickets and so on, which is what happened back in 2001, 2002. So certainly promotion. And one thing specifically within that, I think that the Pay It Forward scheme, which was mentioned by, I think, Jules earlier, was, I think, an excellent idea, and it seems to have not been publicised very much. And I think there's scope for pushing that sort of thing. There were restaurants and bars that were doing that themselves effectively when they sort of offered, give us £100, we'll give you, an evening of free drinks when we reopen. So I think something like that could be coordinated at a London-wide level, whether a sort of GLA-hosted thing like Pay It Forward or something just that was more coordinated by the GLA but done at a business level would, I think, be a really useful thing. So I think there is a desire to continue to support local businesses that are closed from a lot of local people, from a lot of local communities, and I think giving them a mechanism to do that would be really valuable. And in terms of what the government could do, absolutely business rates reform. They are progressing with the review, but even what comes out of the review will necessarily be medium and longer term reform. From the 1st of April next year, the business rates holiday for retail, hospitality and leisure at the moment is going to cease. We need to see a continuation of some form of relief, whether it's slightly more targeted or not, can be a decision made in the coming weeks, but I would emphasise that decision needs to be made in the coming weeks, not even at budget in November, December, because businesses are literally planning whether to keep stores open and people employed following April. We've had some businesses some members tell us that if business rates go back up to 100%, they will be closing up to a third of their stores nationwide. I don't have London figures, so there will be a very significant impact on employment and on the economic activity of high streets if business rates rise to 100% across the board the 1st of April. So there needs to be an announcement very, very urgently preceding any outcome of the business rates review on what's going to happen between the 1st of April and 2023 when a new business rates valuation list comes into operation. So those are my two calls.
Okay, thank you. Gianluca, you don't have to go with the same ones, but if you want to amplify what Kate and Dominic have been saying, very happy to hear that too. it's your turn to go.
I think maybe the other 2 points is one around maybe providing direct support for those businesses that have missed out on the measures that have been implemented so far. I'm thinking maybe about the live music industry, for example, that is related with nighttime economy, of course, that could maybe missed out from direct support. So that's one. And the second one is maybe the Furlough scheme. Sorry to go back to that, but actually in Newham, for example, we've got 53,000 residents that have been on furlough, and again, is maybe some of those disadvantaged communities are going to be affected. So maybe those 2 points about direct support for businesses, but the furlough scheme to maybe keep an open mind and maybe keep it under review by the time that maybe October comes. And in terms of the 2 roles, in terms of what the mayor could do, maybe again without repeating what Kate and Dom have already mentioned, maybe in terms of the mayor's role, maybe around the lobbying, I guess. And then the government is maybe keeping an open mind about these gaps, if you like, and then maybe reviewing it at appropriate time and trying to implement some of these measures or extend these measures.
Well, listen, thank you very much to all of our guests, all 5 of our guests who've given us of their time this morning. I'd really like to thank you for your contributions. Can I ask the Assembly members now, we've got a few things to wrap up, so if our guests want to come off the call, they can, or they can just wait until we finish. You might have someone that you need to be paying attention to, Gianluca, who we've been hearing from intermittently this morning. Could we please note the report that we received this morning and the discussion, and can we also delegate authority to me as the chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any appropriate outputs from this morning's meeting? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, item 7 on the agenda is the Economy Committee work programme, which is found on pages 67 to 68 of your agenda pack. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for 2020-2021?
Thank you.
Thank you. Item 8 is the date of the next meeting, and the date of the next meeting is Wednesday, the 4th of November, and it will be at 10 a.m. It doesn't say that it's going to be in the chamber, but I think that's probably quite likely, but it may be a hybrid meeting again. And can I also just come to item 9, which is any other business that is urgent? There is no business I consider urgent. I declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much.